Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to Black Jewelries and join us for more powerful.
The phone call lasted 3 minutes and 52 seconds. Daniel Ashcombe made it from the parking lot of Union Summit Freight's Eastern Distribution Hub, standing beside his truck in the October cold with his termination letters folded into quarters in his jacket pocket and his breath rising in front of him in the gray Harrisburg light. He had been calm when Preston Colt read the violations to him across the conference table. He had been calm when Renata Cole signed the form, without quite lifting her eyes from it. He had been calm when the security escort walked him to his locker and waited, arms crossed while he collected the two things he kept there: a photograph of his daughter Sophie in her soccer uniform, and a laminated card with his late wife's handwriting on it, a grocery list she'd never fit, which he had never been able to throw away. He dialed the number and it rang once, and a woman named Agatha Renner picked up. And he told her what had happened, and she said, without drama, without a wasted word, understood. "I'll file the activation within the hour." He said thank you. He hung up. He stood there another moment. The wind came up off the Susquehanna 2 blocks east and rattled the chain-link fence along the yard. And somewhere behind him, inside the building, 41 dock workers were finishing the morning shift without the faintest idea that anything about the company they worked for had just changed. He got into his truck and drove to Sophie's school to eat lunch with her, because for the first time in months he had the whole afternoon free, and she had been asking him to come on a Wednesday for longer than he could remember, and it seemed, all things considered, like the most reasonable use of the day he had. Daniel Ashcombe was 37 years old and had worked at Union Summit Freight for 8 years, first as a dockhand and then, for the last 5, as a stenographer who knew every name on every shift, who covered hours when someone's kid had a fever, who kept the incident log with the precision that safety tillers praised every single quarter, and that Preston Colt had, from almost the moment he arrived, found deeply inconvenient. He was not a large man and not a loud one. He wore a pressed collared shirt under his work vest even on the coldest mornings, kept his hair trimmed short and his boots clean enough that new hires sometimes took him for someone from the corporate office, wandering the floor by accident. He had a daughter named Sophie, 9 years old, who left drawings of forklifts and delivery trucks in his work bag some mornings without saying anything about it. And he had been raising her alone since his wife Renee died 3 years earlier, in the ways that some deaths simply are the worst thing that has ever happened to a person, and then continue being that for a long time afterward. Nobody at Union Summit Freight knew anything about the trust. The Ashcombe family trust was established 4 years earlier by Daniel's grandfather, a man named Walter Ash. That's our Dutch trucking sentence. That's as built it into the 4-state regional freight operation, employing 640 people before Holden Education molded it into what eventually became Freight Holdings, Pack Directly and Union Summit, the parent company of Inter. Walter had structured the sale with care, retaining a convertible equity position that passed, on his death 13 years ago, to his son Thomas, and then, on Thomas's death 4 years later, the same year Renee died, a year Daniel did not look back on if he could help it to Daniel himself. Under specific conditions, the trust could be activated to assume direct voting control of Cascade's board. The clause had never been used. Walter used to call it the last resort, and Daniel had always understood exactly what that meant. He had not disclosed the trust to anyone at Union Summit, not because his employment agreement required a disclosure, it didn't, so long as he performed his role without using the position to benefit himself, but because he had learned from his grandfather and from his own years of quietly people that the fastest way to find how something truly worked was to stop being the kind of person it revealed itself to. As a dock supervisor making $41,000 a year, he understood Union Summit Freight in a way no executive in the Cascade Tower had understood it in at least a decade. Preston Colt had been regional director of operations for 14 months. He was 45, educated at 2 schools whose names found their way into conversations he was in no way conducting, and he moved through the logistics was to the particular man who had mistaken the fear of his subordinates for the respect of his peers. He had arrived at Union Summit's Eastern Hub carrying a mandate from the Executive Committee to cut operating costs by 12% before the fiscal year closed, and he interpreted that mandate, as men of a certain temperament reliably do, as permission to be whatever he needed to be. Early in his tenure, he had told a room of shift leads in front of Daniel that a man raising a kid alone doesn't have the bandwidth to run a shift the way this place needs it run, a comment he framed as a compliment to Daniel's effort, which was somehow worse than if he'd simply meant it as an insult. He had also, over those 14 months, developed a habit that nobody above him had noticed and nobody below him felt safe enough to name out loud. The dock workers he rode up most often, docked hours from most often, and passed over for the 2 open lead positions were, disproportionately and without exception, the Black and Latino workers on his shifts. Andre Simmons had been cited 3 times in 4 months for infractions that, when the paperwork was later pulled apart, existed nowhere in the actual incident log. Ruth Delgado had lost 11 hours of pay over a late arrival that the gate scanner recorded as 2 minutes early. Nobody had connected these things into a pattern yet. That was still coming. The humiliations, in the months before any of this came to a head, had arrived in small enough doses that Daniel had mostly absorbed them the way a bird absorbs weather. In August, Preston had reassigned Daniel's usual crew, the same 11 men and women he'd trained personally over years, to a new supervisor, with 4 months of experience, stated grounds of leadership rotation, and had done it on a Friday at 4:50 in the afternoon, 15 minutes before the weekend. So there would be no time left in the week for anyone to ask him why. In September, at a regional meeting attended by 11 other supervisors, Preston had held up Daniel's incident log as an example of what he called old-school paperwork thinking, and joked that some people treated the clipboard like it was going to save their job someday, a line that got a small, uncomfortable laugh from the room. Have laugh give when they are more afraid of not laughing than of what the joke actually meant. In early October, Preston had denied Daniel's request for a single unpaid afternoon to attend Sophie's school conference, citing staffing needs, and then approved the identical request 2 days later for a supervisor who did not have children at all. A detail Daniel noticed and said nothing about. The way he had learned to say nothing about a great many things that quarter. He had not complained to corporate. He had not gone to HR. He had kept doing the job the way he had always done it, with the same precision, telling himself that precision was its own kind of answer, and that a man who kept honest records rarely needed to raise his voice to be believed. He would spend a long time afterward turning that assumption over in his hands, wondering how close it had come to costing him everything before it. Finally, at the last possible hour, turned out to be true. The fraud had started before Preston arrived, but it found in him exactly the oversight it needed. A vendor called Briar Hollow Mechanical Services, registered under a company incorporated by Preston's brother-in-law, Grady Fenn, 6 months before Preston joined Cascade, had been receiving equipment maintenance contracts since month 2 of his tenure. The contracts were awarded without competitive bidding, under an emergency procurement exception that Preston approved himself, each time, personally. Briar Hollows existed on paper. It had a licensed contractor number. It had never performed a single hour of actual maintenance on a single piece of equipment at any Union Summit facility. The invoices, over 13 months, totaled $1,142,690.50. The real maintenance during that same period had been done by Union Summit's own internal crew, whose hours Daniel logged separately, with a precision he brought to everything, a precision that created, for anyone who ever laid the 2 ledgers side by side, an obvious and damning contradiction. Preston had been watching Daniel's documentation for roughly 3 months before he decided what to do about it. The fabricated violations were not difficult to build for a man with administrative access to the incident management system, and no particular hesitation about using it. A forklift near Miss Daniel had allegedly failed to report. A safety checklist bearing his signature, dated to a Tuesday he'd been on pre-approved leave for his daughter's tonsil surgery. 2 witness statements from dock workers whose names appeared on the shift log for that week, but who, when anyone bothered to check later, had not actually been scheduled at all. Preston brought the file to Renata Cole on a Monday morning at 9:14 and told her the termination needed to happen before the week was out. Renata was 40 years old and had been regional vice president of operations for 2 years, promoted from within, aware on some level she hadn't fully admitted to herself that Preston did not consider her a peer. She read the file twice. She noticed the overlap between the checklist date and Daniel's approved leave. She asked Preston about it and got an answer that explained the discrepancy without actually satisfying her as bills to last long, rather than to be true, always leave a particular residue behind. She signed the form anyway. She would spend the next 3 days unable to fully account for why. And on the 4th day she would understand that the reason was simpler and less flattering she wanted. She had been so afraid of Preston Colt in a way she hadn't said out loud to anyone, and the fear had used her hand without asking permission first. Daniel was called into the conference room on a Wednesday at 8:30 in the morning. Preston read the violations off a printed sheet, one at a time, in the flat voice of a man reciting something he'd rehearsed in a mirror. He read the forklift near miss. He read the backdated checklist. He read the 2 witness statements. And his voice did not change at all when he came to the part where those witnesses' names appeared, because he had never expected anyone in that room to check whether the names belonged to people who'd actually been on shift. Renata sat beside him with the form in front of her and did not raise the leave overlap again, though her pen moved once toward the margin of the page and then stopped. Daniel listened to each charge without interrupting. He thought, somewhere in the middle of it, of his grandfather telling him once that the worst thing just for a person do in a room like this was give the room the reaction it was hoping for. When Preston finished, Daniel said only, "Those records are incorrect. I'd like a copy of the documentation to review." Preston said that was a matter for HR during the appeals process, and that Daniel's system success had already been suspended, effective as of the start of the meeting. "You understand," Preston added, in the tone of a man delivering a small kindness, "this isn't personal. I know you've got a lot on your plate at home. Sometimes that catches up with people in this line of work." He looked at him for a moment before he answered. "All right," he said. He stood, shook Renata's hand, which seemed to genuinely surprise her, given what she had just signed, and did not offer his hand to Preston. He collected his badge, set it on the table without being asked, and walked out with a security escort who had 3 years earlier been trained on those exact protocols by Daniel himself, back when Daniel still sat on the safety committee that Preston had since quietly dissolved for budgetary reasons that were never written down anywhere. The activation notice reached Cascade's corporate council at 9:47 that same morning. By 10:15, board chair Eleanor Voss, who had been with Cascade since the original acquisition, and who had known Daniel since he was 17, hauling pallets for his grandfather on weekends, had read the notice twice and called the outside attorney, whose response confirmed everything she suspected and introduced several things she hadn't had time yet to consider. By 11:00, an emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. By noon, outside counsel had opened a formal review of the Briar Hollow contracts, triggered automatically by the activation clause of an independent audit whenever a majority holder exercised board control rights. Preston spent that Wednesday afternoon in his office, finalizing a slide deck on fourth-quarter cost targets. He did not know the audit had begun. He did not know the board had been notified. And he certainly did not know that Nora Pierce, Union Summit's HR coordinator, who had processed Daniel's termination paperwork that same morning with a growing and inarticulate unease, had spent her lunch break quietly requesting the metadata behind the incident reports in Daniel's file. Nora was 33 and had a background in information systems she had never advertised at Union Summit, because she'd learned early on that people who knew she could trace a document's history tended to start behaving differently around her, and she preferred them behaving normally. She pulled the metadata at 12:41 and ate her sandwich at her desk while she read what it told her. 3 of the 4 incident reports in Daniel's file had been created and modified within the same 14-hour window 7 weeks earlier from a Sun's workstation registered to Preston Colt's administrative login, and the dates those reports claimed to describe were weeks further back than that. She printed the report. She put it in her bottom desk drawer. She sat with it for exactly 24 hours before she carried it to Renata Cole. Renata read it standing at Nora's desk on Thursday afternoon and stood very still for a long time after she finished. "How long have you known this?" "Since yesterday's lunch," Nora said. "Why did you wait?" "I wanted to be completely sure before I said anything to anyone," Nora said. "The person who created these records is a regional director, and I'm an HR coordinator, and I needed to understand exactly what I was holding before I decided who I was holding it for." Renata looked at the report one more time. "You should have brought this to me yesterday," she said. "I know," Nora said. "I'm sorry. I wasn't sure you'd be safe to bring it to." Neither of them said anything for a moment after that, because it was true, and they both knew it was true, and there was nothing else to add to it. There was a version of that week where Renata never brought the report anywhere at all, and she knew it, and she thought about it more than once, sitting in her car in the parking garage with the engine off. She thought about the 11 years she'd spent working her way up from a dispatch desk in a building 2 towns over, and then the mortgage payments that were due on the 14th. That mattsette boker forterbings. The bean de Preston date sounds like it a bin det met whether she's big in the room at all. None of that made the decision for her, in the end. What made it was smaller and plainer than any of it the memory of signing Daniel's termination form within her and already knowing something into checklist didn't add up, and the specific unpleasant taste that memory had left in her mouth every single day since. She carried the metadata report to outside counsel on Friday morning. Counsel added it to the audit file and thanked her without telling her anything else the audit had fully turned up, which was standard practice to Tess, and which left her walking her car parking garage with the knowledge that she'd done the right thing and absolutely no idea whether it would matter. She drove home, made dinner, put herself to bed early, and lay awake a long time thinking about the leave overlap she'd noticed and hadn't pursued. And what that said about her, and whether it was the kind of thing that could still be fixed. The emergency board meeting convened at 8:50. The following Monday morning in Harrisburg headquarters, a building press had visited a dozen times and always found appropriately deferential to the importance of his role. He'd been told on Friday afternoon only that it was a routine governance matter requiring regional leadership attendance, and he had spent the weekend preparing nothing because he could not imagine what there would be to prepare for. He walked into the boardroom and found 8 directors already seated, outside counsel at the side table, behind 4 bankers' boxes of documents. Renata Coles standing near the wall with the look of someone who hadn't slept properly in several nights, and Nora Pierce 2 seats down from her, a copy of the metadata report squared neatly in front of her on the table. Preston looked at the boxes. He looked at Nora. He looked at Renata and began, in the half-second before the door opened again, formulating exactly how to make whatever this was Renata's fault. The door opened, and Daniel Ashcombe walked in wearing a charcoal blazer Preston had no framework for at all, because the only version of Daniel Preston had ever built in his head was a dock supervisor in a work vest. And the mind constructs its certainties out of whatever it has decided to pay attention to. It took him a full 3 seconds to place the face. When he did, the room went very quiet. Eleanor Voss spoke first. "I believe most of you know Daniel Ashcombe from the Eastern Hub. For those who need the full context, Daniel holds a majority beneficial interest in Cascade Rail and Forged Holdings through a family trust by his father, Walter Ashcombe, whose company forms the foundation of everything this organization became. That interest was activated last Wednesday morning. That is why we're all here. He wasn't required to disclose. Preston started and stopped and started again. She signed the termination. She's the one who... I signed a document containing forged incident reports and a backdated safety violation created from your workstation," Renata said. "The metadata is in front of you if you'd like to review it." Preston looked at the report. He looked at the Briar Hollow audit summary that outside counsel slid across the table toward him without a word. "This is a misreading," he said, to no one in particular, and then, gathering himself, to Eleanor directly. "I'd like to understand what exactly I'm being accused of here, because emergency procurement exceptions are standard practice across this industry. And if someone wants to relitigate every vendor decision I've made in 14 months, Nobody is relitigating every vendor decision, Eleanor said. We are discussing one vendor, cooperated by your brother and also 6 weeks before your date, that has billed this company $1,142,000 for maintenance work performed by nobody, on equipment that Mr. Ashcombe's own crew was servicing the entire time on a separate and fully documented log. Preston looked around the room at board members who would not meet his eyes at counsel, wearing the particular neutral expressions of someone who has already decided how a proceeding will end and is simply waiting patiently for it to arrive there. And somewhere in that stretch of silence, he seemed to reach the understanding that there was no version of the next 10 minutes that ended in his favor. He said nothing further, not because he had run out of things to say, but because, for once, nothing he could construct would hold. He was informed that his executive authority was suspended pending completion of the audit and a separate outside investigation, that the Briar Hollow contracts had been referred to federal investigators for criminal fraud review. He was escorted from the building by the same security team he had once personally instructed on the correct protocol for removing unauthorized visitors from the premises, and on his way out he told the guard, quietly, that this would not stand, in the flat and unconvinced voice of a man already beginning to understand that it would. What followed over the next several weeks was not quiet, though it was orderly. The independent investigation Eleanor Voss ordered turned up testimony from 3 workers whose names had never once appeared in any incident report, because Preston had never needed paper for what he did to them directly. Andre Simmons described, in a recorded statement, the pattern of write-ups that existed nowhere except in verbal warnings and quietly withheld shift preferences, a pattern once laid next to the disciplinary records of white workers on the same shifts for the same minor infractions, showed a gap investigators could not explain any other way. Ruth Delgado produced her own timesheets, which she had kept independently for 2 years because, she said, you learn to keep your own copy of everything when you don't trust the person keeping the official one. A third worker, a younger man named Colin Reyes, testified that had told him directly during a performance review that he needed to stop bringing his neighborhood into how he talked to customers, a sentence Colin had written down word for word in his phone that same evening, because he knew, even then, that someone would eventually need to hear it repeated back exactly as it was said. Andre Simmons, when he finally sat down for his recorded statement on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, spoke slowly and carefully, the way people do when they have rehearsed things so many times in their own head that saying it out loud feels almost unnecessary. He described the write-up he'd received for a safety vest violation. On a day investigators had been wearing his vest correctly in 3 separate photographs from the yard's own security cameras. He described asking Preston, once directly, why his write-ups never matched what actually happened on shift, and being told that he was reading too much into standard oversight. He described watching 2 lead positions open up over the course of a year and being told both times that he wasn't quite ready, while newer hires with less time on the floor were given the roles instead. I kept my own notes after the second one, he said. Not because I thought anybody would ever ask, just so I'd know I wasn't losing my mind. Ruth Delgado's timesheets, kept independently for 2 years in a spiral notebook she carried in her lunch bag, matched the gate scanner's own records down to the minute, against 11 separate pay corrections Preston had approved that always seemed to run in one direction. Colin Reyes read his phone note aloud to investigators exactly as he'd Preston said it to him, and did not add anything to it, just because he said afterward that it never needed anything added. Preston did not apologize for any of it. That was in its way the most consistent thing about him. In his one formal response to the investigation, he wrote that the disciplinary action he had taken was within policy and stands for maintaining operational excellence, and that any pattern investigators believed they'd found was a misreading of legitimate performance management. He said this in writing, under his own signature, 3 weeks after the metadata had already been entered into evidence. He said a version of it again to the federal investigators who came for the Briar Hollow contracts, and a version of it a third time to his own attorney, who reportedly told him, after the second time, that he should perhaps stop saying it. He said it once more, In essence, in a brief statement, his attorney read outside the courthouse, insisting that his record at Union Summit spoke for itself and that history would eventually agree with him. History, as it turned out, was not particularly slow about the matter. Grady Fenn, his brother-in-law, cooperated with investigators within the first 10 days, which surprised almost no one who had ever met either man for more than an afternoon. Preston was indicted on 11 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of obstructing a federal audit. The case did not go to trial. Renata Cole was named interim regional director of operations 2 weeks after the board meeting. Under a mandate Daniel wrote himself, which began with a single sentence: "This role is accountable to the people it serves, not the numbers above them." Nora Pierce was promoted to HR director for the Eastern Division, a recommendation Renata made, and the board approved without discussion. In the same session, the board ordered an independent review of every disciplinary action Preston had issued during his 14 months. 6 workers, across 3 shifts, Andre Simmons and Ruth Delgado among them, had their write-ups formally vacated and their withheld hours restored with back pay. A new reporting structure went into effect within the month. Any employee at any level of the company could now submit a safety, wage, or conduct concern directly to an independent board committee, bypassing their regional chain of command entirely, with a standing rule that no single manager's login could ever again be the sole author and sole verifier of a disciplinary record. The changes that followed were not announced with any particular ceremony, which was, Renata said later, exactly the point. The independent reporting line went live on the 1st of January, staffed by 2 investigators who reported only to the board's audit committee, and in its first month it received 19 submissions, 4 of which turned out to be unrelated to Preston entirely, and pointed to smaller, older problems in a different division that nobody had ever had a safe channel to mention before. The company adopted a rule, written into the operations manual in language plain enough that a new hire could read it in one sitting, that no single manager could create, modify, and approve a disciplinary record without a second, independent signature from someone outside their direct reporting line, a rule that existed. Everyone understood without needing to say it, because of exactly one man. Andre Simmons was offered one of the lead positions he'd twice been passed over for, and this time there was no ambiguity in the paperwork about why. Ruth Delgado's back pay arrived when the 2 weeks add on top, which nobody at Union Summit called a settlement, and which everyone understood to be one anyway. Renata began holding a 15-minute open floor meeting on the first Monday of every month. No agenda, no manager present unless invited, and the first one ran for 40 extra minutes because nobody in the room had ever been in a meeting like it before and didn't quite know how to end it. Daniel took Sophie to the dock on a Saturday in December, the first Saturday he had ever been there without a shift attached to it, and showed her the loading bays and the forklifts and the log book he had kept for 5 years with a precision that had, in the end, mattered enough that someone had tried very hard to make it disappear. She looked at the rows of shipping containers stretching down toward the river, and then she looked up at her father. "Is this what you do every day?" she asked. "This is what I've been doing every day," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "It always is," he told her, "when you finally get to see it from the outside." He had been having dinner with Renata Etches-Ailta. Nothing announced, nothing named, just 2 people who had lived through 2 weeks through opposites side document and found, over time, there was more to say to each other than that week had given them room for. Sophie had met her twice. The second time, she'd shown Renata the forklift drawings she left in her father's work bag, and Renata had studied them with exactly the seriousness they deserved, and asked 3 questions that made Sophie go back and revise one of the forklifts on the spot. Daniel had watched that from across the table and hadn't said anything about it then, and hadn't said anything about it since, because some things are quietly, over time. The same way honest things had always made themselves known to him in his life, not announced, but present, visible to anyone paying the kind of attention that doesn't require a title, or a trust, or a wrongful termination letter to make it real. The phone call had been 3 minutes and 52 seconds. Everything that came after it took considerably longer and mattered considerably more, and started the way most things that matter tend to start, with his who assumed he was nobody, deciding by accident to show the world exactly who he wasn't. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.